Welcome to the American Dance Therapy Association's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar series, Conversations from the Edge. It begins with the leaders. My name is Laura Wilson. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the Continuing Education Manager for the American Dance Therapy Association. I will be moderating this evening's webinar. This webinar is the second in a 6-part series. The first webinar, Building an Equity Agenda, was aired on March 8th. It will be publicly available for on-demand viewing this week on the ADTA website and the ADTA YouTube channel, as will this webinar. While there are benefits to watching this series sequentially, as each webinar builds upon prior content and established relationship, it is not requisite to do so. Each webinar also stands on its own. We welcome those who are returning to the series, those who are attending for the first time, and those who are watching this at a later date on demand. Before we begin the work of this webinar, allow me to do a brief orientation. This webinar is being recorded for future use. All participants are muted for the entire webinar. You are invited to ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will save questions for the Q&A portion of the webinar following the main presentation. This webinar is free for public viewing. ADTA members will receive 1.5 CEs as a member benefit once your full attendance has been confirmed. This webinar is eligible for ADTA, NBCC, and New York LCAT continuing education hours. In order to receive your continuing education certificate after the live webinar, you must first complete an online webinar evaluation. For those viewing this webinar on demand, you will receive your CE certificate after completing an evaluation and a brief quiz. You will be directed to the evaluation and/or quiz at the close of the webinar. The presenters of this webinar do not have any financial arrangements related to the content of this activity to disclose. This webinar is designed to be an interweaving of transparent conversation, vulnerability, listening, and learning, and serves to address the following learning objectives. 1, to discuss leadership in the context of white dominant culture. 2, to review how to recognize and address unconscious bias in the context of leadership and decision-making and membership. And 3, to learn ways leaders and others can take action steps toward a more equitable organization. Now I'd like to introduce the voices that will be taking part in this conversation. Carmen Marshall, Director of Consulting at Maryland Nonprofits, is an expert trainer, facilitator, and keynote speaker. Informed by her work in civil rights, Carmen is dedicated to working with world changers, organizations, and leaders who are serious about making progress in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her passion is integrating coaching, facilitation, and training to call upon the giftedness and greatness in others who work in the nonprofit sector. Carmen is the creator of Uncovering and Confronting Racism, Laying the Foundation for Transformative Change, a program designed to help organizations in their equity and inclusion work. Her work with CEOs, boards of directors, and teams has earned her the reputation of peaceful gatekeeper and master facilitator. Carmen is a Standards for Excellence Institute licensed consultant. She has served as a member of the Ethics Committee at the Standards for Excellence Institute and is a professional coach certified by Coaching for Transformation. Carmen is the former executive pastor of the historic Bright Hope Baptist Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, formerly led by the late Congressman William H. Gray III. In that role, she shouldered both the executive and senior pastor responsibilities in the absence of a senior pastor. She is the first woman to lead the congregation in 107 years. She is also the former executive director of the National Black Media Coalition. Carmen will be inviting into conversation ADTA President-elect Paul Savett and ADTA President Margaret Migliorati, whom I invite now to take the microphone.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, everybody. My name is Margaret Migliorati, the president of the ADTA. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this important discussion tonight. Before I get into this slide, I want to start by acknowledging an error that I made in our first March webinar. I was providing a very brief overview of the history of the Multicultural and Diversity Committee within the ADTA, and in particular, the earliest years when it was still an ad hoc committee. And I named the co-chairs in those first few years of that ad hoc committee. When I did that, I failed to mention one co-chair, Christine Hopkins. We have fixed that error in the recorded on-demand webinar, but I wanted to name it tonight for two reasons. The first is I just wanted to publicly apologize to Christine and also acknowledge her hard work at the start of the MDC committee. But secondly, I think my error reflected a larger pattern of harm that has happened within the ADTA, which is leaders such as myself not always taking care and not always giving credit. And so it seems very important and appropriate to name that and acknowledge that as we start this webinar. Transitioning to the slide, this slide it talks a little bit about what brought us here today and to this webinar series. And I'd like to read these acknowledgments out loud verbatim. We, the white and privileged leaders of the ADTA, believe that it is important to acknowledge the catalytic forces that have brought us to this discussion in this webinar series. These include pain, harm, and ongoing repair, a commitment to do and be better, to raise the standard at the ADTA, a commitment to correct inequities and mistakes, both historical and right up to this very moment. We understand that as leaders and as individuals who are privileged within our association, we cannot help others if we are not brave enough to shine the light on ourselves and engage in truth-telling. And so it is that intent in which we enter tonight's conversation. I also want to share that although it is not our intent, we recognize that parts of this conversation may be traumatizing for some individuals watching. And as we always do as therapists, we encourage you to be aware of that and to take care of yourselves however you need to. And with that, I would like to, you already heard her introduction from Laura, but I'd like to welcome and turn this over to my friend and my mentor, Carmen Marshall.
I'm delighted to be with you tonight, and I look forward to this conversation. I'm mindful of intent over impact, that while the special acknowledgments have been made, we're mindful that this conversation has the capacity to get under the skin of many, and yet I invite us to move as we need to be our authentic selves, to embrace truth-telling and embrace truth listening. Could we go to the next slide? A few days ago on May 25th, George Floyd, a brother, a friend, a son, a beloved co-worker and family member, had his life taken from him, murdered by the Minneapolis police. We were horrified and mortified, and our country is still reeling in the midst of his murder in broad daylight. I have sons. It's not easy talking about it. It's not easy watching it. And as one whose career has been spent leading difficult conversations, I don't come to you with a script, but with an open heart, with complete compassion and complete candor in this conversation. So as we talk about the loss of life, we do so in mourning. We do so with anger and a range of emotions. And I'd like to acknowledge the family of George Floyd, his extended family. And I'd also like to acknowledge my people and people of color everywhere as we continue this conversation, and open an invitation that it doesn't end here, that we continue to have those difficult conversations, those brave conversations. And for many, it may be hard to hear, may be hard to be in that space. We acknowledge the support of those others who stand with us. And we won't rush through. We'll face the reality like we always do. It is what it is. And now it's time for us to face some truths about what it means to be an American, what it means to be Black, and even what it means to be white, and how those things intersect. If I didn't say it, my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I invite each person to take care of themselves as we move forward. Unfortunately, the situation didn't start with George Floyd. What makes it so horrific, even more, is we've had over 400 years of trauma. People being enslaved, people being kidnapped, Dred Scott, Jim Crow, segregation, lynching, various types of lynching, modern day lynching, the fight for education, the fight to have housing, the fight to vote, the fight to have civil rights, marching, boycotts, bombings, assassinations of leaders, trauma upon trauma upon trauma. And all of this, these recent events occurred during a pandemic where we are forced to live, many of us, in isolation, practice social distancing, adjusting to a new way of being and living, wearing masks. And if you're Black in America, there are additional things to be considered. Not only do you consider your health and well-being, but all of the inequities that Black people have suffered and continue to suffer in this country. Why am I talking so much about Black people? Simply because of where we are right now. We certainly acknowledge the suffering and oppression of other peoples, Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, Brown peoples, and others, because oppression is oppression. In this instance, however, we're going to talk about the oppression of Black people primarily. But in a system of oppression. There are people who are lifted up and some who are put down. And so systems of oppression work no matter who's sitting in the seat. So we're going to address some of that tonight. But the ongoing trauma that we've experienced, a white woman, Amy Cooper, threatened, weaponized her whiteness by calling the police on a Black man, saying that she was being threatened. Ahmaud Arbery lost his life jogging through the neighborhood. Breonna Taylor shot down in her own apartment. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, on and on and on it goes. Not only is it tragic, it's exhausting. It brings up a lot of emotions. But George Floyd's murder just ripped open deeper, and even a wound that was already open. A wound that exposes racism for what it is, white supremacy for what it is, a system of violence, a system of death that strikes at the heart and core of what's really wrong in America. So let's take this moment to do what we do as dance movement therapists and use our bodies. I'm going to turn off my camera and my microphone, and I invite you to move. Laura's going to watch our time for us. And let's just move in our bodies and take care of ourselves. I want to ask Margaret and Paul to come back to the mic and to the camera. So Margaret and Paul, I thank you for being willing to have just a real conversation. We've had many of them over the last year, some very tough conversations, and I appreciate your sticking to your word. I remember when we began to work together, one of the things I said to you was, if I work with this group, I will bring complete compassion, complete candor, and no BS. And you said, bring it. And as a result, we've had numerous conversations with the board, affinity group members, and others that I know have not been easy. And yet that's the only way to move. And so this past weekend, the ADTA leadership was called out by some of its members. And despite the fact that we've been doing a lot of work over the last month, made promises, still have promises to keep, done some outstanding work with members and the affinity groups and all of that. We're at another point in our work, actually. And I want to invite you yet again to what may be an uncomfortable conversation. And I do so unapologetically, right? Because we know this is the work. If change is going to come and change is going to be made and promises, in fact, are going to be kept, it'll be done taking risks. It'll be done telling the truth. And you keep going until you get it right. And so the membership called out the leadership. And I'd like for us to talk about that. I don't know who wants to start, Margaret, Paul?
I'll go ahead and start.
Okay.
Thank you, Carmen. Thank you for the context setting and helping hold this space. As you said in the context setting last week, yet another murder, another senseless, brutal, painful murder happened in the context of other recent murders that you named, which are only a few that I'm sure happened, in the context of a pandemic, as you said, that is hurting people of color economically, health-wise, far more than white people. And I and the ADTA collectively were silent. And we were silent in spite of the fact that it's actually been 1.5 years that we've been working with you, in spite of the self-reflection, in spite of the commitments, we were silent. And many brave members spoke up. They spoke up on social media, they spoke up in our email box, they spoke up on the phone, and they spoke up in text. And it wasn't their job to speak up. It was not their job. And so our silence most immediately hurt people. But that silence last week was not the first silence, right? So it was the most recent silence. And so it's important for me to look at and think about the passivity, the complacity, and the silence and the pattern, and the fact that is life or death. So that's where I'll start.
Thanks, Margaret. I'm Paul Savette. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I too need to acknowledge my silence in the face of this, what I'll call a horror. Personally, it struck me so impactfully that I've realized only recently that I shut down inside myself. I withdrew from being present with what was happening. I resisted watching the video of George Floyd being killed. I did finally watch it. And it was horrible. There are no words. It was horrible. It was abhorrent. It was disgusting. Every word that you can think of. And what I realize now, it hit me so hard that I could not be there for other people in the ways that I should have, needed to, and wished that I had been there for the members of color in the ADTA, I should have been there. And I'm ashamed of myself. And I don't often use the word shame because I think it's about a beingness piece, but in this case it fits. My beingness did not show up as to who I want to be in the world and who I want to be for the members, for the dance therapists who are my colleagues and my peers and my friends. And I know apology is very hollow, but I offer one. And I will do better. That's my commitment to myself, to show up as who I want to be, who I am in even the toughest situations that we face.
I want to encourage us tonight also to name what we're talking about. So, because that's part of it, right? How we talk about things. When we say, I was silenced, if somebody played this recording in 6 months, would they know what we're talking about? So, go on, Paul.
I was silent in that I didn't reach out to the people who were being harmed the most in the organization that I have the role as leader. I wasn't there for them.
Yeah.
And they needed me, us to be there for them. Again, in the face of the impact, the compounding of trauma upon trauma upon trauma, upon trauma upon trauma upon trauma that culminated in the latest murder of 5-6 days ago, George Floyd.
Margaret, did you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you for asking for precision. I agree. For me, what I mean by the word silence is I did not attend to relationships in people's hearts who were most hurt by this. And I and the ADTA did not step up immediately and very loudly stand in solidarity against this latest incident and white supremacy, the sickness that is, in my opinion, my problem as a white person, our problems as white people. And I get beyond anything that I also froze last week, and I will not, I don't need necessarily to go there and say what was going on for me, but I get beyond, I get it that was my privilege to do that, right? That's my privilege. So precision in words. What I mean by that is I could compartmentalize. I could tune it out while running the rest of the ADTA, while going to my job, while going to the grocery store.
The difficulty is that if you're Black, you can't tune it out, right? If you're Black, you wake up with it, you go to bed with it. Every interaction, you're mindful of it. You're trained to respond a certain way. And so I'm glad you raised that privilege. You see, without relationship, these are the things that happen. If you're trained in America, if you're white and born in America, you are trained not to see, trained not to engage. So you can go your whole life and never pay attention. And part of this work is living and being and leading, in fact, in a space and in a way that where your eyes are open and your ears are hearing and your natural response is to be alive and awaken to the plight of others. You alluded to privilege, Margaret. One of the things that you have the option of engaging in the fight for liberation or retreating into your privilege. You can do that all day long, in and out, right? And yet I'm hoping, and I believe what is happening is, I think being called out is good. Because you can't build relationship without it. You can't build relationship without it. And so, Paul, I appreciate you sharing, that you felt ashamed, and yet, in spite of it, you still have to show up for those that you lead, right?
Well, and for me too, part of my privilege, particularly as a white man, I don't really have to be vulnerable. In a conversation earlier today, I was reminded about the strength that comes from vulnerability. And that's kind of like a post-it I need to put up all over my bathroom mirror, in my car, and wherever I am, on my computer, on my phone. That kind of privilege is so harmful. It just is part of the system of oppression. And I'm going to keep working to not go there. I'm sure I'll make mistakes, but that's my work, to not go there.
And what happens if you go there? What happens if you go there accidentally? What happens if you make another huge blunder? I mean, what lessons do you take into that?
The degree of harm, once again, that it perpetrates, the kind of hurt that, and the opening of or deepening of an already open wound that you talked about earlier. And I want to be aware in my own body of the beginnings of when that starts to happen, so that I can stop doing that, so that I can breathe through and let that go and find the softer, vulnerable place. Because in this situation, the softer, vulnerable place is so painful. He's, he knelt on the man's neck and killed him. And we watched, and people on the sidewalk said, "Stop." And he kept doing it. That kind of pain, I can't shield myself from. There's no benefit to me or anybody else that I'm in relationship with to avoid that pain. So again, I'm sure I'll make mistakes. I'm sure I'll slide back towards the white supremacist upbringing that was inculcated in me. And I want to keep moving forward on that continuum, away from and towards, whatever the words are, equity, towards inclusion, towards dismantling of the white supremacy system.
Because it's a system of death.
Yeah, exactly.
It
relies on it.
Yeah.
Requires it.
Margaret, any thoughts?
A lot of thoughts. Okay. Vulnerability. So the thing I want to say about that, just going back to your question, for me, the vulnerability is staying with painful feelings, for sure. But the vulnerability is, and was, as I slow down myself down, what happened for me last week and look at it, was the fear of being vulnerable and the fear of making statements or saying things and getting it wrong. And that is, so that's me being afraid to be vulnerable, to get it wrong, to be called out, to have uncomfortable conversations. So I'm aware of that. I think a lot about Brene Brown's work on vulnerability, which I read. So I'm aware of that was in play for me, and is in play for me a lot. Is in play for me in this moment, right here and right now. Is in play for me right now.
You know, you can study, practice, and never come into the truth, right? And part of knowing whether or not you've grown or actually moved is what we do when we're under pressure. And so the temptation comes, right, to pull back, to be silent, I mean, it's natural to be horrified. It's natural even to be in shock. But it's also natural it's also important to move on and to do what's right and to move into the work. Right. Let me look at the
comments.
Carmen, may I pause for a moment?
Yes.
And interject at this moment. We've had a couple comments.
Okay.
And there was a request to name the intention of the remaining time. Seems like we are hovering on the leadership's process of white fragility.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We're going to be talking about, in a few moments, about dominant culture and its impact on leadership and relationship with membership. And then we'll take questions after we move through those comments. Thank you for that. Was there anything else, Laura?
Yes, I saw that. I just wanted to respond to, or not respond to, but just name out, and I don't quite have it in front of me, so I don't remember it, but that it's also important to name that that the silence and not attending and not being present hurts all in the ADTA, hurts the ADTA, and hurts our ability to be therapists. I'm paraphrasing it, and I apologize to the person if I didn't get it right, but to name that also.
I guess I want to say too that in feeling into and speaking towards my emotions, I'm not in any way asking anybody to take care of me. I'm not trying to turn the conversation around to, oh, that poor white guy, he had trouble too. That's nothing. This is just an accounting of what happened for me and how much hurt and harm it caused to the ADTA and our membership.
And I'd like to lift up a comment that speaks to that a little bit. It says, as the speakers have mentioned, compartmentalizing is a white privilege and is systemic. As a Black DMT student, I and my fellow students of color are asked to compartmentalize what is happening in order to, quote unquote, show up in class and for assignments during this hard time. How do we show up? It's been hard to learn, focus, and be present when we and our uncles, fathers, sisters, mothers, etc., are being targeted.
And I saw a couple other comments, and then I will, Carmen, let you move on, which is don't confuse vulnerability with fragility, and that the point is it's not about us.
That's right, and it's not.
It's not.
That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm. And so with that, I hear that. I'd like to take myself off video and take myself off microphone and let you continue, Carmen.
Thanks, Carmen. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Let's take a moment and just move, if we could. I'm going to take myself off just for a few moments. Let's just move using our bodies. So we talked about racism being a system of oppression. And that system has everything to do with who holds the power, who controls the decisions, who has access. And it's not about being nice or about having certain programs. It's about who holds the dominant position. Those in power in a system of oppression determine or attempt to determine the direction of a group. In a system of oppression, folks are silenced. And in dominant culture is what is seen as normal. The dominant culture is what's seen as normal and is what's seen as, it sets the expectation of what's right and what's wrong, what's legitimate and illegitimate. And dominant culture decides what the norm is, that privilege is the rule, decides who's in or out. There are stories that uphold why that higher status is legitimate, why the benefits and advantages are legitimate. It sets the tone for future communication and relationship unless it's challenged. And I believe it was Nelson Mandela who said that if a person can't live the life that they believe in, they will have to become, they will have to rebel against that. And so the direction we want to go in today is to challenge that dominant culture, that there has to be room for everybody to be who they are, without permission, without approval, without acceptance, without asking for acceptance. And to say no, that your way is not the norm for me. But in a system of oppression, let me just say it like this. The most horrific metaphor for racial oppression was the death and the murder of George Floyd. That is the knee on the neck of a person. It is the most horrific metaphor for what it is to be under the sway of a system of oppression, because that system squeezes the life out of you. That system says that you can't have your dreams. That system says that if you want to work here, you have to be silent. That system says that if you want to go to school here, if you want to be a member here, then you have to line up to what we say is the rule. That system of that metaphor of choking and squeezing the life out of George Floyd is a horrific metaphor for what a system of oppression does. That we have rules if you want to be in this space, and if you don't, we'll silence you, we'll threaten you, we'll impugn your integrity. And over and over and over and over again, it says that your life isn't valued, that you don't belong, that we don't want you here. And it's the violence of that system that says no matter how many degrees you have, it's the violence of that system that says no matter how much experience you have, it's the violence of that system that says no matter what you bring to the table, it's not enough. The violence of that system says over and over again, prove it, prove it, prove it, prove it. And that if we don't sanction you, then we will erase you. And it's in that context that we're having this conversation. That we, I feel somewhat limited in the language, because I recognize that this conversation and this, what we're talking about is bigger even than us. But if it gives us any, and especially my white colleagues, any indication of what a system of oppression really does, that it says line up, it says comply, it says that we set the rules of engagement. And that's what the conversation is about. That's what the outrage is about. That's what the exhaustion is about. It's to come against a system. It's bigger. This system of oppression is bigger than any bad individual or evil individual. Because what upholds the system are codes and laws and practices that are centuries old. And that's why the apologies can ring hollow, because if we don't talk about this at the cellular level, the old practices will raise up again and again and again. And so we have to name that this is oppressive, this is racist, this is seen as white supremacy. We have to say what we're talking about. Even using terms like diversity, equity, inclusion can just turn to mush if we don't name that to not lift these things up cause death to careers. How many people have walked away from careers or been driven from careers simply because of the exhaustion, simply because of the constant targeting and threatening? How many people have gone to Ivy League schools and come out damaged simply because they received the message over and over and over again that you're not good enough, you don't measure up, you don't belong here? And so that's what we're talking about tonight. That if it's in the ADTA or in the education system or any other system, it has to be called out. I'm looking in the chat right now to see if there are any other comments that are coming in. Laura, can you help me? I'm struggling to read these. Can you give us give me a couple of the comments in the chat?
Sure. Okay. One comment is the system is huge and perpetuates oppression. Clinicians are told to be a blank slate. We are told that we have to watch what we say on social media. I spent days feeling like my hands were tied because of my profession. I had to justify verbally to others in my life that it didn't feel professionally safe to speak my mind about this atrocity. I needed the ADTA to come out. And then there's another question that says to ground this discussion specifically in our work at the ADTA, I'm wondering how oppression has been seen in this organization.
Could we bring Margaret and Paul back for the, let's just talk just a moment more.
Yes.
So Margaret and Paul, let's talk about how oppression has been seen in the ADTA, and then I'll go back to my portion. Any thoughts around that, how oppression has surfaced or been talked about?
I will start. So there are many people who are in the ADTA or have been or no longer in the ADTA who have felt like there is not a space for them. There's not a way for their voice to come forward, who have felt that the education that they received, which while we are not educators, we set education standards, that the education they received was very Eurocentric, that different forms of dance, different forms of expression, different forms of scholarship have not been invited, welcomed. We run as a hierarchical association, which is what most associations and businesses I have ever been involved in run as.
Let me stop you for just a second, okay, because those are two important points.
Okay.
One, you talked about the standards of acceptance or entree into the ADTA, the education, I believe you said the education standards is a way, I have been primarily Eurocentric, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as your organization is not purely Eurocentric, that can be seen as problematic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so those are the kinds of things that we're talking about, naming and talking about. That's how movement and change happens when we don't ignore those specific things we can put our fingers on and say, this has been primarily Eurocentric.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we need to consider, you know, expanding that, right? And some might say, well, how is that Eurocentric? I mean, how is that oppression if simply because it's Eurocentric?
I think it's a good question. What I would say is that for individuals who are trying to get educated and establish careers, or have in the past, but I will speak for now, if they do not feel that, if they feel that there is one path, one definition, one strict, I can't think of the word I'm looking for, then I imagine and I hear that it feels oppressive because what you have to bring to the table is told it's not a value. It's not as legitimate. It does not matter. And then on top of it, it can feel as I hear and as I start to experience that, you know, so much of dance has come prior to Western dance, has come from indigenous cultures and indigenous practices. So then it can feel like, right, and somebody just said that we created the work.
We meaning Eurocentric white
Yeah, right,
culture.
right.
And so while this might be an education for some, it might also be uncomfortable and an aggravating conversation. And in reality, if you are people of color coming from all over the world, you want to feel as though this is an organization where you can bring your voice, bring your gifts, your talents, your contribution, right? And have it be acknowledged, be respected, be considered.
Can I say something too? I do not profess to understand or know all of this. Okay, I don't, and I think these are very, you know, good questions. I think they're, you know, they're important questions for specificity, and I appreciate them. And I think what I'd like to say, in addition to, you know, some of the things I said, to try to be specific at my best level of understanding right now, is where I am in the process is that I have heard from enough people in 2 years as president about the pain they're experiencing in our profession. And I don't in any way, shape, or form believe that we set intentionally our association up to be oppressive. However, I'm going to just say this straight out. I think it's arrogance to think that we would be different than the rest of society. And I think we have to be willing, well, we don't have to be, we don't. But I am standing to say, as leaders and as the board, and I hope other folks come along, to be willing to maybe disagree with some of this terminology, white supremacy and oppression, maybe think it's, you know, it's uncomfortable, it's too strong, and yet be willing to hear and to explore both our reactions about why it's so uncomfortable, and also where there's truth, where change needs to happen. So I just want to be clear. I do not hold, and I would rather have direct voices come forth and be able to share in safe ways, create safe spaces within the ADTA as part of action steps and some commitment steps, where voices can come and speak for themselves. Because I don't want to suggest that I understand all of this and where I am in my development right now. But what I do understand is we have to listen if we want to be the ADTA. That is what I think in our hearts and in our values.
Paul, did you have any thoughts?
I think another piece that people experience in oppression is with microaggressions, where as a white person, I can't speak well. Anyway, the blinder idea. I just don't see it, so therefore it doesn't exist. And I can make comments. I can act towards, be with people in ways that don't recognize who they really are, don't respect the cultures that they come from, and that those microaggressions are a way that people feel unsafe. They feel not accepted, not seen, which to me is even more likewise, we're demoralizing. Thank you. Right, because it's an existence piece.
That's right.
Right.
It hurts.
Who you really are doesn't matter to me. What matters is how I see you and how I think of you. And that, yeah, hurtful.
Yeah, and if I didn't intend to, then, you know, my intent should override the impact that I just had.
Right. And intent means nothing. The actions that you take with other people, the way you are with them, is what matters.
And yet, as an organization of healers, therapists who reach people in crisis and some of the deepest parts of themselves, you owe it to yourself as an organization to be bigger than just one, you know, to have a broader understanding of humanity. Isn't that right? To have a broader understanding about who you are, who's a part of the ADTA, who you serve, right? Part of that savior complex comes from not knowing really who you are, your role, and who you're serving, who you're helping, right? Paul, I heard you say the other day that, you know, we're not coming in as if we have all the answers to save these poor people. That's not how we're coming in, right? And yet, if we walk around in arrogance and ignorance, you can very well come off that way. Yeah. Any other thoughts around dominant culture, around one way, one rule, one? I mean, I can imagine some folks saying, you know, you know, people need to just get over it. Slavery's over, and you know, we've made a lot of progress. What is it that people want? You know, you have to take risks as leaders. And I guess that's what I'm doing tonight, asking you to step into that place of vulnerability, because it's in that place as a leader that you don't just lead white people, you don't just lead Black and brown people, right? You're leading people who touch people and who bring healing and comfort and safety and help to people. Right.
I just want to add one thing based on what you said. You know, my experience in this field and with the people who came before me, who I hold in incredible esteem, this is not necessarily, I don't think, what they, I think a lot of them marched in civil rights, and a lot of them fought very, very hard. And so I think what's been hard for me, I'm going to say what's been hard for me. What's been hard for me is to recognize that being a good person, being a quote unquote non-racist person, which I no longer believe exists, but I did for a period of my life, is you know, being a non-sexist person, a non-homophobic person, a non-trans, whatever, you know, whatever Latinx, whatever you want to put in there, you know, is not enough. And that it's really about being willing to hear people's pain right now, even within, like, so I very much believe even within, you know, if we can't do it within our organization, our own members, can we hold that pain? Can we listen to it? Can we build relationships and together look at where do we want to go with education? What makes most sense? Where do we want to go with our governance structure? Mm-hmm. That's out of there are certain things that are right or wrong, absolutely, but out of sort of that dichotomies and into relationship and into holding and hearing, and then exploring and learning from each other. We also have great generational chasms, you know, learning and also learning from each other.
Mm-hmm. So the ADTA is a multi-generational organization, right? And has a rich history and legacy of lots of work, as Margaret mentioned, and yet the organization can honor legacy, honor past work, and at the same time grow into embracing new work and new people and their contributions. And so if the relationship isn't built authentically between the membership, right, then the organization stays stuck. And but the questions and the calling out and the naming of things and increasing our understanding requires taking risks, requires having these courageous and brave conversations, requires telling the truth, hearing the truth, taking responsibility for your own education. And thus the relationship is built, you know, we talk about, and trust is built as trust is earned, right? And so while it may seem that we're fumbling and stumbling, it is necessary, I think, for the growing of the organization to get to know its members, to step up its understanding of one another, to acknowledge those patterns that have held the organization back, and then break through those things through these conversations. And so I just wanted us to see that it's kind of, it goes around it. You can't take a relationship, a workshop or do a webinar and say, okay, we built trust. It continues, it's round and round, and we continue to have these conversations, continue to listen deeply, continue to make sure that, that everyone's voice is valued, that folks feel seen, heard, and understood, and to continue to go deeper. Because as we lay the groundwork for this conversation, then the idea is to be able to have any conversation. So whether we're talking about another group, whether we're talking about, and I'm not talking, I don't mean to mix up the conversation, but what I mean is whether we're talking about the trans issues or the LGBTQ IA, whether we're talking about, you know, regardless of community, we want to make sure that our conversation is open, honest, continuous, and that relationships are built over time, and relationships are built through honest and authentic communication, honest, authentic action, and accountability. So let's go to the next couple of slides. Right, so stay right there. So some of the things that, some of the ways that dominant culture shows up in the membership is through microaggressions. Microaggression is a term that was coined, I think, back in the 70s, but sounding small, but having big impact. Folks may say that, oh, you're pretty for a Black girl, or you're handsome for a Black man, or you're not like all the other brown people, or I don't see race. Those are all ways to be aggressive toward people. On the one hand, you may think that you're saying, giving a compliment or being nice or kind, and in the other way, you're totally being violent against that person. So if you say something like, I don't see race, the person is, very much aware of their race, that means then you don't see them. And so those kinds of learnings have to continue to be a part of our conversation so that we don't continue to inflict pain, trauma, cause people to feel isolated and invisible or unheard. And so without talking to one another, we won't know these things. Next slide, please. So let's talk about how to identify and confront bias. First of all, we want to acknowledge that everyone has bias. But when you are able to identify your bias, be willing to receive feedback without being defensive. Get curious about your own defensiveness or your own feelings. Why is it that when I'm called out that I feel anxious or I feel anger? Why do I feel the need to continue to justify myself if someone says that what you just said was a microaggression? Why do I feel that uncomfortable if I'm being confronted about my privilege? And so it's important that each person and each individual does his own work, be responsible for his own education about your personal biases and blind spots. Educate yourself about these things. There's the implicit bias test that you can take. I believe we have resources at the end of this where you can check your own biases. You might be surprised at what you learn about yourself. The other thing is be willing to be accountable. When you are called out, don't run from that. Be willing to listen and learn and practice. Right? And don't expect Black and brown people or other people of color to carry the burden of your education.
Carmen, this is Margaret. Can I just read a comment based on that?
Yes, come on back. You come back on screen.
I just want to name this and say it. It's directed to me, Margaret. While you name you don't understand what is oppressive, you should have been doing the work instead of asking people to come to you directly and tell you how you've hurt them and me. People who have been hurt so badly are tired. Do not ask persons of color to come to you and tell you how you hurt us. This asking already shows how unsafe it would be to come to you because you have not been listening. Would you ask George to tell the white cop how he has hurt him? Mm-hmm. And so I just want to read that and name it. That is related to exactly what you just said.
That's what we're talking about. Not only naming it, but owning it, right?
And owning it. I'm sorry. Owning it.
That is a practice that can see the thing about implicit bias or unconscious bias, as we call it, is that it comes from some of the deepest parts of our unconscious. And the point of having these deeper conversations is to become conscious of it, right? And to take responsibility for becoming conscious, right? Not going to the person as the participant just named and say, oh, how did I hurt you? Oh, I'm so sorry I hurt you. I'm so sorry I just shot you, or I just killed your brother, or I'm, destroying your life in some way or another. Thank you for sharing that. Are there any?
And thank you to the person for saying it.
Yes, and thank you everyone for your candor who's writing in. Paul and Margaret, I want to invite you back on screen. Are there any other things, Laura? I know we've got about 15, maybe 10 minutes left.
We've got about 7 minutes, I think, before.
Okay, all right. Anything else that we need to lift up in the chat?
Let me take a look. We can all take a look for a moment. And would this be, since we only have about 10 minutes left, shall I also look at the questions and see if there's something specifically in there?
I want to name Tony McDade. I see this in the chat. Tony McDade, Black trans man, was killed this week and was notably left out of the list. Thank you for lifting that up.
Yes, yeah. Yes, and that Black trans rights matter too.
That's exactly right.
I would
There's
like
also, oh, go
I would
ahead.
like to lift up the question, wondering if there has been any research to be able to quantify how many Black dance movement therapists have left the field, and if there have been any efforts to reach out to them.
I don't know of any research. And in terms of efforts, it's a good question. I'll just say not enough. I'll say not enough. We don't collect data on those, race or other types of identity demographics. We're talking about that. And so it makes it a little hard, but I think informally, there's ways to reach out to people.
Let me just also mention that I appreciate you, Paul and Margaret, being willing really to get on the point and have these conversations because the ADTA is not unlike, organizations everywhere. What's most important right now? This is the first of many conversations that we'll continue to have. Where do we go from here?
Yeah. Can I just call out one other name that Nina Pop was stabbed in Missouri. So somebody took the time to write that. So I will say for me, what's most important, there's probably two major things. One is to continue to have conversations. This is a little one-sided, and I understand that because people can only talk back through chat, so it's not ideal. But to continue to have conversations ongoing. The second thing I'm thinking a lot about and trying to work towards and put into place is what is a system of accountability? What does that look like? How do we get that in place so that we don't lose track, that we keep moving forward, that we keep having these conversations, that we keep looking at our systems, deciding what served us really well. Does it, for a while, or serve some of us really well for a while? Does it still? So those are the things, relationship and accountability, systems of accountability that I'm thinking a lot about right now.
Paul?
Yeah, I would agree that those two are really the key. Relationships in particular. How do we keep creating spaces, opportunities for conversation, for discussion, for being called out, for then doing the repair work when harm happens, which it inevitably will happen. And being able to have those relationships with one another to keep the work and the accountability piece moving forward.
I was just looking at the chat.
Yeah, I saw that somebody said what they need help with right now is how to be a therapist. I didn't read the whole chat, it came up and disappeared. But how to be a therapist, how to support people, how to be a therapist. I think we have to do that piece too, right? So we've been focusing tonight on our internal, turning the mirror around, but that's an important piece of the ADTA also is just like we tried to mobilize very quickly with COVID, some support groups in terms of therapy, doing televideo therapy. I think it's similar here. We have that role also.
Yeah.
Please call on the white dance therapists in this webinar to hold leadership and peers accountable.
Mm-hmm.
So called.
And as we continue to lay the foundation to have these conversations, it is our hope that every conversation can be had after this, right? Because this is one among many but we want the practice of movement, of delivery of service to be enriched, having gone into these uncomfortable places, right? That your work is not simply, I mean, you're dealing with hearts and minds, you're dealing with bodies, there are lives on the line through your, of the people that you touch through your work. What else is important before we hand the mic back over to Laura with final, anything else?
I think I will just say I truly, truly hope, I know there's questions that didn't get answered, I know there's comments that didn't, chats, that people will continue to join the conversation. I hope we move more too.
I appreciate everybody being here. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, even though it wasn't so much of a give and take necessarily with participants. And that I too remain open to all the conversations that need to be had, that need to be held. And, I'm here.
Thank you. And so with that, let me extend my thanks as well for your time and willing to engage through the chat. I look forward to the time when we'll be able to have more intimate conversations, more truth-telling, more accountability, more learning. Thank you, Laura. I'll hand it off to you. And thank you for allowing me to be your facilitator tonight.
Thank you so very much, Carmen, for facilitating this conversation, and Paul and Margaret for being part of the discussion, and to everybody who joined us this evening. I want you to know that I am saving the questions, I'm saving the chat. These thoughts will not disappear. We will look at them closely. We will follow up on that. There is opportunity in the evaluation at the conclusion of this webinar to provide comments, and I invite you to give us your honest feedback. What would you like to see more of? What would you like to see less of? What kind of conversations could benefit our progress moving forward? I do want to make you aware of the future dates of the webinars in this series. The next one is Beginning a Sensitive Conversation on July 7th. And registration will open for that in a week or two. The remainder of the series will be open for registration once the new ADTA website is launched. So look for that towards the end of the month or in July. But these are the topics that we're going to be diving into in the continuation of this series. If you have any questions, you may always reach out to me about continuing education opportunities or concerns at ce@adta.org. You also may contact the office at info@adta.org. When this webinar concludes, you will be directed to that evaluation. We thank you for taking the time to fill it out. You will receive your CE certificate from the ADTA office within 2 weeks. Thank you very much for being part of our process tonight. Be well.